One of my earliest childhood memories was a typically bitterly cold London winter's day. I was about 4 or 5. I was sitting on top of my father's broad shoulders, holding onto his neck and feeling the warmth of him through his scarf. My mother walked beside us slowly, with her hand protectively on my back, worried that I would fall, as my father kept bouncing me left and right, playfully. I remember that moment so well. I felt so loved, so secure, so warm inside. I was raised by 2 incredibly loving and supportive parents, but growing up, I soon realized how precious that was and that how not everyone was that fortunate. My parents were the type of people who were always of service to others, not waiting to be asked for help, but rather looking for opportunities to do good. My father would often say, "There are so many people who don't have a voice to call for their needs. You just have to listen carefully enough." But it wasn't until 2011, when the conflict in Syria erupted, that I really found my calling. For someone of Syrian origin, the Syrian conflict was and still is incredibly traumatic. Over 480,000 Syrians have been killed. Between them, several of my family members, friends, and more recently, colleagues. My husband, a surgeon, very early on became involved in medical humanitarian relief in Syria, traveling with many other UK doctors to Syria. I was inspired by him and the many other wonderful people around me who were stepping up to the needs of those most vulnerable, whether they were doctors, teachers, or volunteers collecting supplies. I was a mother to 2 young children, and when my husband would travel, sometimes for months on end, I would feel their vulnerability and how their father's absence was affecting them. I was a first-year PhD psychology researcher with a strong background in parent training. Now, key parent training principles are to encourage parents to embrace their children with love, with praise, with warmth, to listen to children, to use assertive discipline, and to make sure parents take care of themselves too. I felt surely, with my background in parent training, I had an added advantage, a strong advantage, in being able to care for my children through this tough time. But I began to wonder how parents in Syria were coping with parenting their children. How do you parent your child when you find yourself living in a war zone? How do you reassure your children that they will be okay when you don't know if you will be alive tomorrow? How do you convince your children to listen to you now and run, because this may be the only chance you have of getting them out alive? I couldn't get these thoughts and questions out of my mind, so much so that I changed the topic of my doctoral research to one that focused specifically on understanding the needs of families during conflict and displacement, and how we could help them. I spent the next 2 years conducting research based on interviews in refugee camps in Syria and in Turkey, and often just sitting with families in their tents and asking them how they were coping and what they needed help with. What I found was very heartbreaking, and many of their stories and faces still haunt me today. The parents or primary caregivers, when parents had been killed or separated from the family, were really struggling to care for their children. They watched their children's emotions and behaviors change. Children were bedwetting, thumb-sucking, terrified of loud noises, bright lights, having terrifying nightmares. They'd become aggressive, depressed, angry, withdrawn, and parents had no idea how to deal with this, and how would they? Family interaction and the quality of care that children receive in their families is a key predictor of children's future outcomes. things such as their mental health, their well-being, their adjustments. But as much as I traveled in refugee areas and as much as I spoke to families, I simply couldn't find any available resources for families to access to help them in parenting their children. But I wasn't just relating to the struggle because I was a parent myself, but because every single one of us can relate to the feelings of being a child and looking to your caregiver for support and the comfort of their confidence, regardless of whether we received it or not. So, in response to this identified gap, myself and my colleague, Professor Rachel Calum at the University of Manchester, have spent the past 6 years developing and implementing family skills resources of different types that are open access and free for families and those working with families to access. With so many families around the world struggling in conflict and displacement contexts, we felt the first thing we needed to do was to find a way to reach a large number of people, of parents, very rapidly and at low cost. So we developed our first parenting resource, myself, colleague Professor Calum, and Dr. Kim Cartwright, a double-sided parenting basic information leaflet that had key parenting principles and information based on the needs that we had identified from my interviews with families. Information such as to spend time reassuring children, to be honest with them, yet not overburden them with your own fears and worries, to encourage play, maintain routine when possible. On the advice of NGO staff at Watan Foundation, we used their existing humanitarian supply route of bread delivery to deliver basic parenting information. Inside the bread wrappers that were used to deliver bread to families on a daily basis, we inserted the basic parenting information leaflets. We wanted to know if families would engage, so we also inserted a questionnaire into the bread wrappers too. We distributed 3,000 of these in just 3 days. We were astonished at the response. Over 60% of families responded in a conflict zone. Over 80% of those rated the usefulness of the leaflets as quite a lot or a great deal, many leaving comments on the questionnaires too, asking for more advice on dealing with grief, terror, bereavement. These families really were engaging in this information. One mother had written, "She saw her father being killed. How do I get that memory to stop coming back to her at night?" Due to a lot of demand and much global attention, these leaflets have now been distributed into many languages and are used in many different contexts around the world. We took what the family said into mind about wanting more information, and we worked with a group at the Children and War Foundation, a wonderful group of prominent psychologists who have a child trauma recovery program called Teaching Recovery Techniques. We adapted this program by adding a whole new stream of parenting sessions that families could access now with knowledge and with skills, as well as supporting their own children through trauma. We trialed out this program to start with Syrian refugees in a town on the Syrian-Turkey border. And we were delighted at the end of the program to see families had improved their knowledge, their skills, their family functioning, and families were much happier. One mother described how she would rush home after each session, enter her block of flats so excitedly, knocking on the doors of her neighbors, gathering them as she made her way up to her own flat, wanting to share what she had learned. She felt empowered by the knowledge and the skills, and the difference it was having to her family. A real turning point to the dissemination of this work was when the prevention group at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime became really interested in what we were doing. Very quickly, I found myself working with a highly influential global team of like-minded people who shared our passion to see family skills resources available globally to families in all contexts, whether refugee contexts or simply low-resource settings. Working with this group has been instrumental in disseminating and magnifying our message and has really given us a platform of hope. It has allowed me to speak at United Nations meetings, calling out to heads of state and policymakers with a message I so strongly believe in. Often not wanting to get off the podium because I have one more story or one more voice I want to share to convince those listening of our cause. Through their global network, I have become involved in a number of different projects and their evaluation in several countries, such as Afghanistan, the West Bank, Serbia, and Zanzibar. And these global experiences have only reinforced in me, with certainty, that almost all families in the world will jump at the chance to be better informed in how to care for their children if they realize how important their role is in their child's future. I see myself quite simply as a vehicle transporting and illuminating the path of this message, the direction of which is really led by the needs we discover along the way. For example, last year, we were about to deliver the Teaching Recovery Techniques plus Parenting program to Syrian refugees in Lebanon. A few days later, before I was due to travel to conduct the training, a bomb went off in a town close to where I was traveling to. I was no longer allowed to travel, though I desperately still wanted to go. We had screened 600 children for this program, and of them, 320 had clinical levels of post-traumatic stress. On the great advice of Professor Kalem, I borrowed a camera, locked myself in my office, and simply recorded basic training videos of the training and transferred them to Lebanon. To my delight, on the same day of the training, a projector screen was set up and training commenced using the videos I had sent and also some interactive Skype training sessions too. Families received the program. Realizing how powerful tele-training materials could be in reaching families in low-resource areas, unstable or dangerous areas with materials has really led us now to push our work to ensure that all family skills programs we are developing are also packaged as tele-training materials too. A couple of months ago, my home city of Manchester was shaken in the most terrifying way by a cowardly terrorist attack on a concert theatre filled with schoolchildren. A couple of days later, my neighbor told me that her friend and her 12-year-old daughter had been at the concert, and her daughter was really struggling with flashbacks, anxiety, and nightmares. They had visited their GP, who had simply said, "This is a normal reaction, and she will probably get better in a few days." No advice was given to the parent at all on how she could support her daughter, though she was asking for it. A few days before that, I had just returned from the West Bank, an area riddled with conflict and war. There I had been trialing a new family skills program that we had developed. I realized at that point how frighteningly similar the experiences of the families I had worked with in the West Bank just days earlier were to those of my neighbor's friend and her daughter. I shared the materials with my neighbor, and her friend called me a few days later and told me very emotionally how much the materials had made a difference to her and her daughter, how it had given her control over a situation she had no idea how to deal with, empowering her, making her feel like she was doing the right thing. In 2013, I took my children, then aged 8 and 9, to a Syrian refugee camp as part of a global humanitarian aid convoy. I encouraged my children to take part in activities with other refugee children, really wanting to instill in them a burning passion to want to help others. I made a conscious effort, though, not to point anything out to them or give them any talks, but to let their experiences be their journey, to be their education on this journey. On our way home and in an airport in Germany, I looked for a place to pray, and was directed to a multi-faith meditation room. It was a small, bare, strange, white room with nothing in it but a large tree trunk right in the center. On this tree trunk were messages that all travelers from different faiths, non-faiths, and traditions had left. Messages of hope and of, peace and wishes for the future. I left my children mesmerized by this tree trunk, turned round, laid my prayer mat on the floor, and began to pray. Halfway through, I noticed my daughter put her hands into my handbag and draw out 2 pens, handing one to her brother and keeping the other for herself. Once I'd finished and turned round, I found both of my children leaning into this tree trunk, writing messages. As I leaned closer, I found my son had written in Arabic, his second and much weaker language, Allahu Kareem, which translates directly as God is so generous, but is really used as a phrase to show gratitude and gratefulness for what you have now and hope for the future. And a phrase that was used so often by the refugee families we met, the children and the adults. At that point, I was certain I had made the right decision in taking my children along. If an 8-year-old can benefit so much from simply interacting, playing, engaging with those less fortunate, what effect could it have on us? Children don't come with manuals. Often the only experiences we have of parenting our children are of being parented ourselves, even if that was a good or bad experience. When we realize that children are our hope, we realize that all families in the world matter a lot. If they're living in a conflict zone, experiencing a man-made tragedy or natural disaster, or whether they're our neighbors, struggling with a financial problem, a disability, a divorce. Have you, like me, ever felt your own home suddenly feel like a war zone when you're struggling to cope? When we realize that children and the relationship between caregivers and children is so powerful and meaningful, we will develop global public health models that give all families access to resources to help them to care for their children in a way they deserve, giving them knowledge and skills. This knowledge will be relevant to the different circumstances and contexts that families all over the world live in. When we do this, we will slash the number of children who are experiencing mental, emotional, and behavioral problems, reducing rates of violence, of crime, and addiction. And parents will be happier, more confident, more satisfied. Despite all that is happening around the world and the escalation of violence and destruction, our task collectively is to ensure that all children around the world have a safe place within their caregiver and parents' arms, if nowhere else. And then can we begin to change the world for the better, one parent at a time. Thank you.